It was the scream of sirens that woke me, slicing through the quiet Sunday morning like a blade. My first thought was that something had happened to a neighbor, maybe an accident, maybe a fire. I threw on jeans and ran to the front door, only to find 2 police cruisers idling at the curb, lights flashing and standing right in my driveway. Arms crossed like a queen awaiting tribute, was Karen Whitfield, the HOA president and self-proclaimed enforcer of neighborhood standards. My wife, Emily, stood on the porch in her robe, bewildered and clutching a mug of coffee. One officer turned to me and said, "Sir, we've received a call about domestic neglect, specifically failure to provide meals." I thought it was a bad joke. Karen smirked, brushing imaginary lint from her expensive cardigan. "It's about time someone enforced the rules. She hasn't been preparing proper dinners for her husband, which reflects poorly on the community's image." For a moment, I couldn't even speak. The absurdity of it all fought with a rising tide of fury. "You called 911 because my wife didn't cook?" I finally managed. Karen's voice was syrupy with condescension. "It's not just about cooking, it's about tradition, presentation, respect. This neighborhood thrives on appearances, and neglecting such duties lowers the tone for everyone." Emily's knuckles tightened around her mug, her eyes narrowing. The officers shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing they'd been dragged into something ridiculous. I told them politely there was no crime here, thanked them for coming, and watched them leave with a look that said they'd rather be anywhere else. When the cruisers disappeared, Karen stayed put. "You may think this is over," she said, her tone smug and final, "but I'll be bringing this up with the board. Fines are coming." That was when my wife smiled a small, dangerous smile I'd seen only a few times in our marriage. "Mark," she said quietly to me, "tell her." So I did. "Karen, the entire HOA budget, every event, every maintenance job, every decorative streetlight is paid for by one source, the community trust my grandfather established. That trust is managed by us." Her smirk faltered. "What are you implying?" I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "I'm not implying anything. I'm telling you, you've been trying to fine and embarrass the people who write the checks that keep your little kingdom running." The next morning, instead of lying low, Karen doubled down. She sent an email to every resident claiming that even financial contributors must adhere to community etiquette, and accusing Emily of domestic dereliction. But here's where the twist came. A man I'd never met before showed up at our door later that afternoon. Tall, silver-haired, with a folder under his arm, he introduced himself as David Brooks, a retired federal mediator and, as it happened, the husband of the HOA treasurer. He'd read Karen's email and had been waiting years for an opening to unseat her. "If you're willing," he said, "I can help you take this public and force a vote to dissolve the board." That night, Emily and I hosted an impromptu gathering in our backyard. Word had spread fast. More than half the neighborhood showed up, some clutching copies of Karen's email, others bringing stories of petty harassment. One elderly couple recounted being fined for having mismatched patio chairs. A single mother choked up describing the time Karen photographed her kids' toys in the yard and posted them in the HOA newsletter under Eyesores of the Month. By the time David stood to speak, there was no doubt we had momentum. He laid out the process. Call an emergency meeting, present financial evidence of our role in funding the HOA, and force a no-confidence vote. But Karen wasn't going to let it happen quietly. The following day, she stormed onto our property, this time with 2 board members in tow, and tried to hand us a cease and desist letter. Emily took one look, walked back into the house, and returned with a bound ledger, the official trust account records. "These," she said, flipping to the most recent pages, "show every check we've written to your HOA. No trust money, no HOA budget. You want to fine me for not cooking? Try running this neighborhood without our funding." The board members exchanged nervous glances. One of them mumbled, "Karen, maybe we should talk about this," but she hissed at him to stay quiet. That's when I decided to deliver the final blow in front of as many witnesses as possible. I invited Karen to the emergency meeting, knowing she'd show up to defend herself, and she did, sweating under the fluorescent lights of the community hall, clutching a stack of fabricated bylaw violations, against half the people in the room. I stood, handed the ledger to David, and let him read aloud the annual contribution amount, $186,000. Gasps filled the hall. "That's not just part of your budget," David announced. "That's the entire budget." Karen's face went pale. The silence after David's words was heavy, the kind that makes you hear your own pulse. Karen's lips trembled, and for a second I thought she might actually try to laugh it off. But then the murmurs began low, angry voices rippling across the hall as neighbors turned to each other, realizing in real time that the woman who'd been terrorizing them with fines and threats was surviving entirely on the goodwill of the very people she was trying to humiliate. "Is this true?" someone demanded from the back. It was Mrs. Grayson, a widow who had once been fined for hanging a wind chime on her porch. Karen stammered, "It's irrelevant. The board still has authority," but she was cut off by Mr. Alvarez, the same man she tried to evict last year over a so-called lawn violation. His voice boomed across the room. "Authority? Without their money, you've got nothing." The momentum shifted like a wave. One by one, residents stood up, recounting their own run-ins with her tyranny. David raised his hand for quiet, then laid out the vote. "All in favor of removing Karen Whitfield as HOA president effective immediately?" Hands shot up row after row. Even the two board members she dragged along reluctantly raised theirs. Not a single vote in her favor. The moment was so swift it almost felt surreal. Karen's face flushed a deep crimson as the room erupted in applause and relieved laughter. She tried to gather her papers, but they scattered across the floor, and no one bent to help her. For once, she was just a persona title, no clipboard, no audience willing to pretend she was in control. But that wasn't the end. 2 days later, Emily and I met with the new interim board 5 neighbors who actually wanted to serve, not rule. We made our position clear. The trust would continue funding the HOA, but only if they rewrote the bylaws to strip away the absurd power Karen had abused. Gone were the rules about approved holiday decorations, mandatory lawn height, and gendered domestic duties. In their place, new guidelines focused on community safety, property upkeep, and voluntary contributions to beautification projects. And here's the poetic twist: Karen didn't just lose her position. She lost her platform. Without the presidency, she had no authority to demand anything from anyone. And when the interim board voted to refund unjust fines, several of her past victims sent her formal invoices for repayment. Within a month, she was drowning in small claims court notices. The final time I saw her was at the community's summer kukuda tradition she used to micromanage to death. This time, she was just another attendee, standing awkwardly near the lemonade table, ignored by most, avoided by many. Emily, ever gracious, walked over with a plate of food and offered it to her without a word. Karen took it, eyes downcast, and muttered something that might have been, "Thank you." It wasn't an apology, but it was as close as she'd ever get. In the months that followed, our neighborhood transformed. People planted flowers without fear. Kids rode bikes without someone snapping photos for safety violations. And the community hall, once a place of scolding and humiliation, became a hub for potlucks, game nights, and honest conversation. The trust continued to fund the HOA, but now it was a partnership instead of a paycheck for power. Looking back, I realized Karen's 911 stunt wasn't just an insult to my Wi-Fi, it was the match that lit a fire under the entire neighborhood. Sometimes, it takes one absurd, overreaching act to wake people up to the truth they've been ignoring for years. And sometimes, the best revenge isn't crushing someone, it's cutting off the very stage they used to perform. What about you? Was ending her reign this way the right move? Or should we have handled it in silence and let her fade on her own?